Good morning, everyone. We're continuing our series today of living in strange times, thinking about the story of Joshua. And his strange time was that he spent 40 years living in the wilderness as part of the people of Israel. But where's that in the bigger story? Well, he followed Moses as the leader of the people of Israel. Moses was the one who led them out of Egypt, away from Pharaoh. Remember the 10 plagues that interacted between Moses and Pharaoh. And Moses led the people for 40 years, but he wasn't going to be the man who led them into the promised land, into this land called Canaan. Joshua succeeded Moses, and at the start of the book of Joshua, which is where we're focusing our thoughts today, they're poised on the edge of the land, ready to cross the river Jordan and conquer the land. But we first hear about Joshua as one of the 12 spies sent by Moses into this land of Canaan 40 years earlier, just after they'd left Egypt. 10 of those spies said it would be impossible for them to conquer the land, but Joshua and his friend Caleb said they would be fine because God was with them and had promised the land to them. However, the view of the 10 prevailed, so all the people spent 40 years wandering in the desert as punishment. So Joshua was a man who trusted God and had seen God protect them and provide for them over those 40 years. And he'd been trained up by Moses to take over leadership of the people. And now is the time for them to take new ground, the land God had promised them. This promise had been made hundreds of years before to a man called Abraham. The promise from God was that Abraham would be the father of a great nation, that God would be with them too. And those two promises had already been fulfilled. The third part of the promise to Abraham was that they would have a place to live, and this was to be Canaan. So as we joined the story, were they, and especially Joshua, ready to step into God's promises, and the strange times of 40 years wandering was to be over. And as we think about this, I think there are three things for us to consider from this story. Firstly, don't let past failures and current circumstances or difficulties stop us taking ground. It would have been easy for Joshua and the Israelites to give up on God's promise. They'd been 40 years in the wilderness, making many mistakes and being impatient, as we heard last week. They could have said that because of all their mistakes, God would give up on them or wouldn't give them all that he had promised them. We can often think like that. We mess up, we make mistakes and think that that can disqualify us. And that can stop us personally and corporately as God's people taking new ground. We can disqualify ourselves when God doesn't. This story and all of the Bible is the story of God using flawed people to take new ground. Moses was a murderer, but he was the person God chose to lead them out of Egypt. Gideon was a very timid man, but he led the people to victory over the Midianites. Samson was reckless, but he won great victory for the people over the Philistines. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but he went on to be a leader in the early church. And Paul persecuted that same early church, but then he was the one who took the gospel all the way to Rome. All of those made big mistakes in their lives, but God still used them in amazing ways. So if you've messed up in your life, and I know I have, you and I are not at all disqualified from stepping into all God has for you. Secondly, it's possible to stay in comfort and miss out on the promises of God. The people of Israel were made up of 12 tribes, which came from the 12 sons of Jacob. In Joshua chapter 1, we read about 3 of those tribes, Reuben, Gad and Manasseh, staying on the east side of the Jordan. The land of Canaan was in the west of Jordan. So where they asked to stay was not the land that God had for them. But when they'd arrived there at the end of their wanderings, they liked the look of the land. It was good for them. It was good for their crops. So they went to Moses and asked if they could settle there. And Moses gave them permission. That sounds okay. That sounds like they'd found a land. But it wasn't the land that God had promised them. They settled for less and didn't fully step into God's promises for them. They perhaps settled because it was going to be too easy. They wouldn't have any battles to fight. We must be careful that we don't let that happen to us at any time, or particularly in this season that we've been through. Although it's not been an easy time, in some ways it will be easy for us to be comfortable as we come out of this time. However, I think it's really important we don't let that happen. We need to remember the promises and vision that God has given us, both individually and corporately as Life Church and as Bury Christian Fellowship, and trust God to lead us into those promises, God to lead us towards that vision, and for us to go with him. Thirdly, even when God speaks and we're obedient to his voice, we do need to be bold and courageous. It's really significant, I think, that the first verses we read at the start of Joshua highlight this. Joshua is commissioned in chapter 1 by God to lead the people, and he promises again to give them the land. But then God goes on to say this: "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous." And then a bit more in chapter 9. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua had been faithful and trusted God. He knew God had watched over them, was with them, and God was supremely able to bring about his promises. But Joshua and the people would need to be bold and courageous. You would have thought it would be easy for them to take the land if all those other things about God were true. But actually the opposite was true. Following God and taking ground for him is not easy. We can talk courageously and think courageously, but we need to act courageously too. A few years ago, I was a key holder for a cricket club pavilion near where we lived, across the park. And one day I got a phone call to say that someone was suspicious that someone was trying to break into the pavilion. David and Johnny, two of my sons, were around. They were perhaps 6 and 8 at the time. And when they heard this, there was lots of brave talk for them. I'm sure David picked up one of his plastic swords and said, "Come on, Dad, let's go and get them. Let's go and beat them up and tie them up and put them in prison." So they came with me when I went to investigate. It was a nice sunny day. It was nothing to be afraid of. We walked into the park and across the cricket pitch, and I got to the door and unlocked it to see what was going on inside. And I looked behind me just to check the boys were with me, and they were quite a long way behind me. They hadn't kept up with me. As we got nearer to this potential sign of danger, their courage had gone away. They were absolutely fine. And there was no drama. There was no surrendering to the IRA, as Andy had in his story a couple of weeks ago. All was well. But we need to be more than say that we're going to be courageous. We do need to act with courage. And it's not easy. Doing things we haven't done before, going places that we haven't been before, is not easy. But like Joshua, we can be confident of God being with us if we're going where he wants us to go. So I think I've just got 3 challenges for you that come out of those 3 points. Firstly, have you disqualified yourself from something because of your past? Or thinking as Life Church or Bury Christian Fellowship, are there past disappointments as a church that are stopping us moving where God wants us to go? Just take some time to ask God about this. Sometimes those things can be hidden and we need him to reveal them to us. And then we can ensure they're not holding us back. Secondly, are you settling for less than God's promises? Are you comfortable? Again, this can apply to us individually or for us together as a church. We don't want this strange season to result in us stopping where we shouldn't. What new ground is there for you and for us? And finally, do you know what God has for you, but you're fearful? I can only say to you what God said to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Let's make sure in these strange times that we're ready to take new ground together. God bless.